I'm counting down the top 15 most important roads in history. These roads connected civilizations and they shaped the modern world. Today, I'll explain the stories behind them and why they're the most important roads in the world. Let's start with number 15. The Persian Royal Road. The Persian Royal Road in the Achaemenid Empire is one of the earliest clear examples of a road doing way more than just helping people travel. It helped hold an empire together. Running across Anatolia towards Sardis and the Aegean, it gave the Achaemenid Empire something every large state struggles to control: distance. Some parts of the route existed in earlier forms, but under Darius I it was improved and organized into something much more deliberate. What made the Royal Road so powerful was the speed of it. Messages that might once have taken months could move across the empire far faster through a relay system of stations and couriers. That changed everything. A ruler who can receive news quickly can answer rebellions, collect taxes more effectively, manage the officials, and coordinate troops over a huge distance. Without that kind of communication, even a strong empire starts to loosen at the edges. With it, though, the central power will reach much farther than it otherwise could. The Persian Royal Road showed that roads weren't just conveniences, they were instruments of control. They helped turn territory into a functioning political system. Instead of scattered provinces with weak links to the center, Persia had a route that connected the administration, commerce, and military movement in ways earlier states had struggled to do at the same scale. It also had a long life beyond people who organized it, and that's how truly important roads work. Once a route proves itself, the later rulers will keep using it because the landscape has already made the argument for them. Alexander the Great later moved along the same corridor during his conquest of the Persian Empire, which does say a lot about the road's strategic value. Dynasties changed, but this route still made sense. Number 14. The King's Highway in Jordan. Some roads become important because they're new. The King's Highway became important because it kept surviving. It runs through what is now Jordan, connecting the northern Levant down toward the Gulf of Aqaba, and it's remained useful through one era after another because it follows a line that simply works. Many famous roads belong to one empire or one brief moment in history. The King's Highway has lasted through many. Long before modern borders, this was a north-south trade route linking regions tied to Arabia, Syria, and the wider Near East. Goods, people, and ideas moved along it because the geography encouraged the flow. Later, the Romans recognized the same thing and rebuilt sections of it as the Via Nova Traiana, improving communications between Bostra and Aqaba. Now that Roman phase says a lot. When a major empire arrives and decides the old road is worth upgrading rather than replacing, it usually means the route has already proven itself. That really is the story of the King's Highway. It kept being absorbed into new systems because each new power understood its value. A road like this rarely stays only one thing. It began as a trade route, then becomes a military route, then a pilgrimage route, and then an administrative link. The King's Highway did all those jobs at different times. During the Crusades, for example, castles and fortified sites rose up along the route. Now that's not random. Fortifications tend to appear beside roads that are important. If rulers are defending a route, taxing it, or fighting over it, that means the road is carrying something valuable, whether it's armies, merchants, or political leverage. The King's Highway clearly did. Number 13. The Camino Real de Tierra Adentro. This road was one of the most important ones in Spanish America because it did much more than just connect towns. It connected an empire to its northern frontier. Stretching from Mexico City towards what is now the American Southwest and northern Mexico, it became the main inland route through which silver, soldiers, clergy, settlers, and supplies moved over the course of roughly 3 centuries. The road's real importance, though, goes even deeper than just transport. Its nickname, the Silver Route, tells part of the story. Huge amounts of wealth moved along this corridor, especially silver from places like Guanajuato and San Luis Potosi. Mercury also traveled in the other direction because it was essential to refining silver. Now, this wasn't just commerce on a local scale. Silver from New Spain fed the global exchange, and it helped finance the imperial world of the modern period. A road that carried that kind of wealth was never going to be ordinary, so it became part of the machinery that kept the Spanish Empire functioning. At the same time, the Camino Real was not only about extraction. Roads rarely stay that simple. Once the routes become dependable, it begins to shape everything else around it. Towns grow along it, religious institutions spread along it, and administrative power extends through it. The road helped organize settlement across a huge region, and it tied distant territories more closely to the Spanish colonial core. Without a road like this, the northern frontier would have been much harder to control and much harder to develop. It also became a corridor of cultural exchange, though not always an equal or a peaceful one. Along this road, languages, beliefs, and architectural styles, even laws, moved with the people. Spanish colonial life expanded northwards, but the local and indigenous worlds were part of the same landscape, and the result wasn't a simple line of imperial influence, it was a long zone of contact and conflict. That's one of the main reasons the road matters historically. It helped create entire regions, not just pass through them. Number 12. The Lincoln Highway in the U.S. The Lincoln Highway, it helped teach Americans how to think on a national scale about roads. Before it, long-distance road travel across the United States was still very fragmented and often very frustrating. In 1913, promoters and automobile enthusiasts created the Lincoln Highway Association with the goal of establishing a continuous highway from the Atlantic to the Pacific. That idea was way bigger than just one route. It captured a new vision of the country itself, where one automobile would no longer be trapped inside a local system, but it could cross the continent. That idea was a major shift. The Lincoln Highway wasn't simply an early road from east to west. It became a model for how roads could be branded, promoted, improved, and turned into a national cause. Private donations and public enthusiasm helped build the identity of it, and its success inspired a wave of other named highways. In a sense, it turned roads into something Americans could imagine collectively, not just as a local necessity, but part of the national future. Its practical importance became even clearer in 1919 when the U.S. Army used the route for its first transcontinental motor convoy. That trip exposed just how poor many American roads still were. Mud, weak bridges, rough surfaces, and hard-to-follow stretches made the journey slow and difficult. One of the participants was Dwight D. Eisenhower, and that experience left a lasting impression. Years later, as president, he would support the Interstate Highway System. So the Lincoln Highway did something unusual. It helped expose the inadequacy of the very road system it symbolized, which in turn helped the country push toward something much larger. By the mid-1920s, the explosion of named highways had become too messy to manage cleanly, and the U.S. numbered highway system replaced many of them. The Lincoln Highway itself, though, is broken up into later federal routes like US 30 and many others, and on paper that meant the original name route disappeared. But in a deeper sense, it already did its job. It helped the United States move out of the era of improvised long-distance motoring and into the era of planned national highways. Number 11. The Asian Highway Network. The Asian Highway Network is different from most roads on this list because it's not a relic from the past, it is still unfolding. Instead of being one historic road built by one empire, it's a huge coordinated effort to link national highway systems across Asia into something more continuous and useful. Today, this network includes well over 145,000 kilometers of roads running through 32 countries. Just the scale of that is difficult to picture. But size alone is not the point. What makes the network important is what it's trying to solve. Asia is enormous and politically diverse. In a region like that, transport problems are never just local. A weak road in one country can raise costs across a supply chain that stretches through several others. The Asian Highway Network exists because countries recognize that roads can either trap regions in inefficiency or help pull them together into stronger economic connections. The project itself began in 1959, but it became more structured in the early 2000s when the member states adopted a formal agreement that set out the framework for the entire network. Once the countries started agreeing on how a network should function across borders, the roads stopped being just national assets, they became pieces of a larger system. And that system is meant to do something very concrete: reduce friction. It's supposed to make the movement of goods, people, and vehicles easier across long distances and frontiers. In simple terms, it aims to make Asia work more smoothly as an interconnected economic space. Historically, roads have always helped support trade, administration, and politics. The Asian Highway Network is a modern version of that principle. It's just operating on a continental scale. At the same time, though, what makes it interesting is that it remains unfinished in the fullest sense. The network does exist, but its quality is uneven. Some sections are modern and efficient, others still fall below ideal standards. That kind of incompleteness doesn't make the project less important. It arguably makes it more important because it shows the network is responding to a live need, rather than just commemorating a solved one. Number 10. The Via Appia, Italy. The Via Appia is one of those roads that feels bigger than just a road. It started in 312 BCE under Appius Claudius Casus, first linking Rome to Capua and later stretching farther south and east toward Brundisium. On paper, that sounds like a straightforward project. In reality, though, it became one of the great arteries of the ancient world. Rome needed a fast, reliable route for troops and supplies. The Via Appia gave it exactly that. It turned movement into power. What made the road stand out was how well it was built. This was not a rough track hacked across the countryside. It was engineered to last, with carefully prepared surfaces, drainage, bridges, milestones, and a line that was meant to keep working for generations. A road changes history when people can trust it. Armies can move faster on it, merchants can depend on it, and towns begin to grow because of it. The Via Appia did all three of those. As Rome expanded, the road stopped being just a military line and it became something broader. It linked the capital to trade coming through the wider Mediterranean. It helped connect cities and smaller settlements into one more coherent system. Goods could move more steadily, information traveled more reliably, farmers and landowners along the route benefited from the easier access to markets, and over time, the road became part of the machinery, not just of conquest, but of everyday Roman life. A lot of ancient roads were crucial for a while and then just faded. The Via Appia did not. It kept being used long after the Roman Republic was gone. It remained a route through the countryside, and later it became important in Christian history too. Pilgrims traveled along it, churches and tombs gathered beside it, and people in later centuries looked back as not just old infrastructure, but as a physical piece of Roman civilization still lying in front of them. Number 9. The Karakoram Highway. The Karakoram Highway. It forced a major international road through one of the hardest mountain environments on the planet. This route connects Pakistan and China through terrain that is unstable and constantly changing. It passes through a region surrounded by some of the most formidable mountain systems in Asia, including the Karakoram, the Hindu Kush, and areas near the Pamirs and Kunlun. This was never going to be an ordinary highway. Construction of it took nearly 2 decades, from 1959 to 1978, and it demanded an enormous amount of labor. Thousands of people were involved, and the difficulties were relentless. Landslides, rock falls, avalanches, glacier movement, and the extreme weather were not occasional obstacles. They were part of the basic reality of this project. A highway in terrain like this is really never truly finished in a way that a road on flat ground might be. It's got to be monitored, repaired, defended, and rebuilt because the mountains keep pushing back. It was not built across a place that already wanted to be connected. It was built through a barrier. Before the road, movement across this region was way more difficult, slower, and much more uncertain. The highway changed all that. It created a dependable land link, and that meant more easier travel. It meant less isolation for remote communities and more trade across a difficult frontier. It also changed life at the local level. Borderland roads often get described in political terms, but their real importance shows up in daily experience. A road like this can change access to goods, to markets, and to medical help. Communities that had long lived with the limits of mountain geography suddenly had a more permanent route through it. That doesn't erase the hardships of the region, but it changes what's possible inside them. A lot of people know the Karakoram today for its scenery, and that scenery is certainly dramatic, but it can also distract from what makes this road important. It turned one of Asia's most difficult landscapes into an international corridor, and it showed that a mountain wall could become a working connection between countries rather than just a natural divide. The Karakoram Highway is not just impressive because it's beautiful, it's impressive because it changed the meaning of the landscape it passes through. Number 8. The Grand Trunk Road in South Asia. The Grand Trunk Road is one of the rare roads that feels less like a single project and more like a long-running civilizational line. It's existed in different forms for centuries, and it linked major parts of what are now Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh. Most important roads belong to one period, one empire, maybe one state. The Grand Trunk Road kept being rebuilt, reused, and expanded by one power or another because it kept solving the same problem: how to connect the northern subcontinent across huge distances. Its history goes back to ancient routes that were already important by at least the early historic period, but later rulers gave it stronger shape and infrastructure. Shah Suri is especially associated with rebuilding and organizing the road in the 16th century. Under him, and later under the Mughals, it became much more than just a trade route. Inns, trees, water points, and distance markers help make it reliable and usable across a large stretch. A great road is not only the surface people walk or ride on, it's everything along it that makes the movement sustainable. Armies used it, merchants used it, administrators used it, and messages moved along it, pilgrims and travelers too, and this is all part of why it became so central. The Grand Trunk Road didn't just serve commerce or politics, it served the broader task of holding a huge region together. Roads like that start to shape how cities relate to one another. Delhi, Lahore, Agra, Varanasi, and Calcutta were not just important places standing alone. This road helped turn them into connected centers of a much larger system. When one empire after another keeps investing in the same road, it usually means the route has already proven itself. Geography made the case, and history kept agreeing with it. The line worked, so it stayed. Moving on to number 7, the Pan American Highway. The idea was simple enough to say and incredibly ambitious to carry out: connect the Americas by road, not just one country, not just one region, an entire landscape. Over time, that vision became a vast system of linked national highways running from the far north of the continent down towards South America. Taken together, it stretches for tens of thousands of kilometers, and it's one of the boldest road concepts ever attempted. This was never a one country building a prestige project. It depended on many states agreeing, at least in principle, that their road system should connect into something larger than themselves. That meant infrastructure planning on an international scale. It meant seeing overland transport not just as a domestic issue, but as a continental one. Once that idea takes hold, the roads start doing more than just carrying traffic. They start changing how the countries imagine their place in a wider region. The Pan American Highway did that. It made the Americas feel, at least in practical terms, more continuous by land than they had before. It created the outline of a route that could tie North America, Central America, and much of South America into one overland framework. For trade, diplomacy, travel, and geographic imagination, that is a very big shift. A connected hemisphere is not the same thing as a paved map, but this road system made the idea tangible. Of course, it's not complete. The Darien Gap between Panama and Colombia is one of the most famous breaks in this system, where a dense rainforest and marshland interrupt the overland route. But in a way, that missing link makes the rest of the system much more interesting, not less. It reminds you how enormous the ambition really was. Most of the dream exists in pavement, but the one famous interruption shows just how hard it is to force total continuity across a hemisphere. Number 6. Route 66. Route 66 changed what a road could mean in the modern age. Officially, it was established in 1926. It linked Chicago to Santa Monica, and it helped connect the Midwest to the Pacific coast. Like many early highways, it was assembled from older local and regional roads rather than built as one completely new line. But its timing was perfect. America was becoming a nation of motorists, and Route 66 arrived just as long-distance road travel was beginning to reshape the country. The importance of Route 66 showed up most clearly during moments of stress and movement. During the Dust Bowl, many families heading west towards California traveled along Route 66 in search of work and survival. That gave the road a place in one of the most painful migration stories in American history. Later, during World War II, it served as a major corridor for military traffic, helping to move troops and supplies between buses, factories, and ports. By 1938, it had become the first U.S. highway to be fully paved, which made it much more dependable at a time when reliability would matter enormously. Then came its next life. After the war, Route 66 turned into something different, a road of motels, diners, filling stations, roadside attractions, and family travel. In that period, it became one of the strongest symbols of the automobile age. It was no longer just a practical route, it became a cultural corridor. In that sense, Route 66 helped create the roadside economy as people came to imagine it. Eventually, the interstate highway system did replace it, and Route 66 was removed from the federal highway system in 1985, but losing its official status didn't erase its importance. In some ways, it made it easier to see. Route 66 became a symbol of a turning point in American life, the shift towards car culture, long-distance mobility, and westward movement. It was increasingly organized around highways instead of rail lines. Number 5. The Qhapaq Ñan, the Andean road system. If you want to see what a road can become when it's built on the scale of a civilization, the Qhapaq Ñan is one of the best examples anywhere. This was the great Andean road system of the Inca Empire, though parts of it were older than the Inca themselves. When the Inca rose to power, they didn't invent movement through the Andes from nothing. What they did was take older routes, expand them, connect them, and then standardize them, and then they turned them into a coherent imperial network. The result was enormous. The broader network stretched across what's now Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, Colombia, Chile, Argentina, and it linked mountains, valleys, and deserts. That alone is impressive enough, but what makes it extraordinary is that it happened in the Andes, one of the most difficult landscapes on the planet for large-scale movement. The Andes is not just high mountains, they're a maze of ridges, steep slopes, ravines, plateaus, river valleys, and changing climates. In one stretch, a road might pass through cold highlands above 4,000 meters. In another, it might descend towards warmer valleys or run through dry coastal zones. Some sections were broad and formal, others narrowed into mountain paths, but the larger point is that the road system wasn't accidental, it was designed. It wasn't simply a way to travel, it was the backbone of state power. An empire spread across the Andes and it couldn't function if its rulers, soldiers, messengers, and supplies were cut off. The road solved that problem. A state that could move goods between the coast, the highlands, and other regions had a much stronger chance of surviving any shortages. In a very practical sense, the Qhapaq Ñan made the empire governable. Without something like it, the Inca realm would have been much harder to hold together. This road system also shaped daily life at many levels. Roads create patterns. They influence where people stop, where the storage is built, where the settlements matter, and how local communities are relating to larger political systems. It connected ceremonial centers and administrative hubs. It helped carry labor, tribute, food, and messages, and it also tied the landscape to ideology itself. In the Inca world, roads were not just practical lines, they were part of a structured vision of how obligation and power were supposed to work. It was woven into the order of the empire itself. And there's also something pretty interesting about the speed with which the Inca turned this into a functioning network. They didn't have wheels for transport in the way many old world road systems later depended on, and they didn't use draft animals on the same scale as Eurasian empires. Yet they still built one of the most ambitious road systems in pre-modern history. The Andean answer to long-distance control was not identical to the Roman or Persian answer, but it was just as serious. It relied on human labor, careful adaptation to the terrain, and an enormous investment in infrastructure. The Qhapaq Ñan simply didn't vanish when the empire did. Parts of it remained in use, and its legacy stayed. That's often a mark of a truly important road. Once it's solved a deep problem, later generations keep finding reasons to follow the same line. It helps explain how this region was culturally tied together. In the end, Qhapaq Ñan matters because it proves that roads can be much more than infrastructure. They can be the skeleton of an entire political world. This road system crossed mountains that should have broken unity apart, yet instead it helped create it. When you look at it, you're not just looking at paths through the Andes. You're looking at one of history's clearest examples of a road becoming the physical shape of a civilization. Number 4. The Autobahn. The Autobahn in Germany is often reduced to one easy idea: a very fast road in Germany. Well, that is true in the most superficial sense, but it misses why the Autobahn's really important. The Autobahn became the first major example of a modern national expressway system, and in doing so, it helped change how the 20th century imagined roads. Before this, roads were still often thought of as improvised versions of older local routes, ways of moving between towns and cities, but not necessarily part of the fully controlled network. The Autobahn helped change that. It showed what happened when a country built roads as a separate class of infrastructure designed specifically for movement. The idea had early roots before the Nazi period, including the experimental controlled access roads in the 1920s, but the massive expansion came in the 1930s when the regime under Hitler turned road construction into a national project. Now, this part of the story has to be handled carefully. The Autobahn was deeply entangled with propaganda and state spectacle. It shouldn't be romanticized. This system became a symbol of modernity and national power at the same time that it was being used for a dictatorship for military, economic, and ideological purposes. That is part of its history, whether people like it or not. Still, setting the politics aside doesn't make the road system any less important. The Autobahn showed that in concrete form what a limited access highway network could do for a modern state. And once the traffic is separated from the local crossings and interruptions, long-distance travel becomes much faster and more predictable. Civilian travel changes. Strategic mobility changes too, and it was a vision of mobility built around continuity. And once that vision existed on a national scale, other countries could study it, adapt it, and build their own versions. Many people picture the Autobahn mainly as of the 1930s and 40s, but its long-term impact came from what happened afterward. West Germany expanded and rebuilt the system, and after reunification, as the network became part of a larger German and European transport framework, the Autobahn was no longer mainly a symbol of regime spectacle. It had become ordinary in a different sense. It was a central piece of modern life in one of the world's strongest economies. The Autobahn helped normalize the idea that major economies need national roads to build consistent standards. The Autobahn made the idea visible in a powerful way, and once visible, it became influential. Later highway systems, including those outside Europe, emerged in a world where the expressway concept had already proven itself. And at the same time, the Autobahn shows that great road systems come with trade-offs. Roads at this scale reshape the land, traffic patterns, and energy consumption, and they invite arguments about expansion, noise, landscape damage, and dependence on car transport. In Germany, as elsewhere, the story of a major highway system is not just one of celebration, it's also one of debate. And that complexity actually adds to the Autobahn's importance. It was never only an engineered achievement, it became part of the broader modern agreement about how society should move, build, and organize. Number 3. The Interstate Highway System in the United States. Before the interstate era, America already had roads, highways, and famous long-distance routes. But they're not the same as what came later. They were often slower, more fragmented, and more vulnerable to local interruptions. The interstate system introduced something way different, a national network built to common standards, heavily funded and designed for high capacity. Once all this happened, the United States began to reorganize itself around the road in a much deeper way. The turning point came with the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956. Earlier plans existed and selected routes had already been discussed, but progress was slow, funding was weak, and the country had not yet committed itself. The 1956 Act changed that by expanding the proposed network. It also renamed the system the National System of Interstate and Defense Highways. And that name is pretty revealing. It wasn't sold merely as a convenience for motorists, it was framed as something tied to national interest and defense. The interstate was built around consistency, full control of access, multiple lanes in each direction, standardized lane widths, shoulders, and design speeds all suited to the terrain. It made it possible to travel long distances with a level of predictability that the older roads couldn't offer. And that predictability is not a glamorous concept, but it's one of the foundations of modern economies. Businesses can plan around it. Freight systems can depend on it, and drivers know what kind of road they're entering, no matter what state they're in. Once that uniformity exists, the country stops feeling like a patchwork of separate environments and starts functioning more like a connected space. Even though the interstate highways make up only a small share of the total road mileage, they carry a disproportionate amount of traffic, including very large share of truck movement. It's hard to overstate what this means in practice. A large modern economy depends on reliable movement. Factories need inputs, stores need their stock, ports need inland connections, and cities need commuter inflow. The interstate became one of the main systems making all that possible. But beneath much of that is a road system that keeps goods and people flowing. At the same time, the interstate story is not simply one of national triumph. This power came with serious costs. Urban segments were some of the hardest and most controversial parts of the network. Homes and businesses were destroyed, entire neighborhoods were cut through or displaced, and established urban patterns were broken apart. That tension is part of why the interstate remains such a defining American project. It made the country more connected in one sense, while tearing some communities apart in another. This is one of the central truths of this system. It also did transform settlement patterns far beyond the cities it cut through. The suburbs expanded, logistics hubs spread outwards, commercial strips and interchange zones became major spaces in their own right. Travel habits changed, and vacation patterns changed. The interstate didn't just help Americans move through the country, it changed where Americans lived, where businesses chose to locate, and how regions grew. Roads of this scale don't simply respond to geography, they create new geography. Number 2. The Roman road system in Europe, North Africa, and Western Asia. The Roman road system did something few projects in history have ever done. It helped turn a growing state into an empire. Rome didn't just build a few famous roads and then stop there. Over time, it built a vast, hard-surfaced network that stretched across Britain, Gaul, the Italian peninsula, the Balkans, parts of Western Asia, and North Africa. The roads were there to move armies first, but once they existed, they began carrying everything else with them: officials, merchants, tax collectors, messengers, civilians, and even ideas. That's the moment a road system becomes something much larger than just transport. It becomes part of how a civilization works. At the beginning, the military purpose was obvious. Rome needed to move troops quickly and predictably. In the ancient world, that was a huge advantage. Armies had to crawl through mud, rivers, and broken local tracks. They're vulnerable before they meet the enemy. Roman roads solved that problem. A Roman commander didn't want to hope a route would hold together in bad weather. He wanted to know that it would. That's where the roads start to show their importance. A road like that doesn't just help win the campaign, it makes conquest sustainable. Once a territory had been taken, Rome still needed to govern it, and provinces had to stay connected to the center. The roads helped with all of it. They reduced friction across an empire that was otherwise too large or too varied to manage efficiently. Mountains, rivers, forests, and distance never disappeared, but the roads made those barriers less powerful than they would have been without them. And then something else happened, which is usually what happens with important roads. They outgrew their first purpose. Roads built for conquest became roads for administration. Merchants used them because they were faster and more dependable. Towns benefited because goods and people could move with more confidence. Markets expanded and regional connections became stronger. Once a stable road exists, the economic life starts reorganizing around it. These roads were military in origin, but they didn't stay military in function. But what made the Roman roads influential was the consistency of their construction. They were known for straight alignments where possible, careful foundations, drainage, and a durable surface. The Roman engineers adapted to any local conditions, but there was still a recognizable logic behind the system. The roads were meant to last. They were built with durability in mind, and that durability gave them a second life that lasted far beyond the empire that created them. Many ancient states built roads, but not all of them left behind a network that later societies just kept reusing. Roman roads are often the best answer to the landscape long after the imperial rule faded. Later routes followed them because the hard decisions had already been made centuries earlier. Where should a road cross? Which pass works best? Which river approach is manageable? Where can a long route stay efficient and durable? Roman engineers had already answered many of those questions. That meant medieval and even modern movement often continued along lines first fixed in the Roman period. This is why people sometimes underestimate how deep the Roman legacy really is. They think of aqueducts, amphitheaters, and ruins, but the roads may have had the most practical long-term effect of all. They changed how the world was connected. They helped create patterns of movement that outlasted Roman power itself. And in some places, the line of the old road remained visible. In others, it did disappear beneath layers of use, but either way, its influence remained. A state that can move information, force, and goods efficiently is stronger than one that cannot. The Roman roads made that visible on the landscape. Milestones, bridges, embankments, causeways, and paved surfaces were not just technical details, they were expressions of power. They showed that the state had the ability to cut through terrain and make these connections endure. Number 1. The Silk Road. Even the name is a little misleading. The Silk Road, it wasn't one single road running in a neat line from China to Europe. It was a shifting web of routes, corridors, oases, links, mountain passes, and trading paths that all tied East Asia together with Central Asia, South Asia, the Middle East, and parts of Europe. But it's that complexity is exactly why it matters so much. It wasn't important because it was simple. It was important because it was enough to survive deserts, empires, wars, changing borders, and centuries of political change. Over time, Silk Road routes linked Chinese dynasties with the Central Asian states, Persian worlds, and Islamic empires. Entire stretches rose and fell in importance depending on security and politics, but the wider network endured for centuries. It remained one of the major structures through which Eurasian civilizations encountered one another before the rise of modern maritime trade had reshaped global exchange. Trade is the most obvious part of the story, but it's also the part that's most simplified. Silk was only one of many goods moving across these routes. The network carried spices, metals, textiles, glass, horses, paper, ceramics, precious stones, and countless other commodities. A product made in one part of Eurasia could influence the wealth, status, taste, or production in a very distant one. It's that kind of long-range exchange that changes economies, but it also changes expectations. Once a network like that becomes dependable enough, societies start imagining one another as not unreachable worlds, but as trading partners, rivals, or sources of knowledge and goods. That's where the Silk Road becomes more than just commerce. It was one of history's great transmission systems for ideas. Religions traveled along it. Buddhism moved outward through Central Asian corridors into China. Islam spread through many of the regions touched by the Silk Road exchange. Christianity, Judaism, Zoroastrianism, they all appeared along parts of the network at different times. It didn't just move objects, it moved belief systems, language, art, customs, and intellectual influence. Once that starts happening, a road system stops being an economic infrastructure and starts becoming civil infrastructure. Technology and knowledge move the same way. Paper, printing techniques, metalworking knowledge, artistic styles, even scientific ideas traveled in different directions along different sections of this network. The Silk Road made the exchange possible across an enormous span of the Old World. It also shaped geography in a political sense. Roads do that. Once a region becomes reliable, towns grow around it. Forts are built, custom systems emerge, rulers begin policing, taxing, and defending the flow. The Silk Road helped create chains of cities and intermediary powers whose importance depended directly on the movement. It created new centers of gravity on the map. Systems like this that connect the world don't only spread prosperity, they spread vulnerability too. Disease could move along the trade routes as well as people and goods. The Black Death is often linked in part to the same long-distance connections that made Eurasia more integrated. That darker side's important because it shows how deep the network's reach really was. A route system only spreads danger on that scale if it's already succeeded in binding distant societies together. The Roman roads, they were an imperial network. The Interstate System, it belongs to one nation. The Grand Trunk Road, even across the changing rulers, it remained rooted in one broad regional world. The Silk Road was different. No single power owned the whole thing for very long. It depended on cooperation, competition, tolerance, opportunism, and local adaptation. That made it more fragile in some ways, but it also made it more expansive. It was not the road of one civilization. It was the meeting ground for many. The Silk Road connected civilizations across Eurasia. It carried trade at an immense scale, spread religions and technologies. It helped build cities and shape diplomacy. It turned distance into contact and contact into transformation. No other road system in this list has such a wide reach across such a long span of time in so many different dimensions. The Silk Road did not just help move history along. In many ways, it helped create the connected world that later history inherited.